So longitude and latitude seems to be an intersection between geography and mathematics. Now it has been said that the Earth is spherical. Now do not mind my drawings. So in this video, the first thing I want to do is to explain what we mean by an equator, what we mean by the prime meridian, what we mean by longitude, latitude, great circle, and small circle. So let's take the first thing. What's an equator? Now an equator is an imaginary line that divides the Earth into north and south hemisphere. So it's an imaginary line that passes through the center of the Earth and then divides the Earth into the north and south hemisphere. So this is like the north up, and then we have the south below. Does this make sense? And here is the equator. An equator is an imaginary line that divides the Earth into the north and south hemisphere. Does that make sense? Now the next question is, what is the prime meridian? Now let's say we have the globe or the Earth's surface. The prime meridian is an imaginary line that divides the Earth into the eastern and western hemisphere. So it's an imaginary line passing through the center of the Earth and divides the Earth into the eastern and western hemisphere. Now to our right is east, and then to our left is west. Does this make sense? So the prime meridian divides the Earth into the eastern and the western hemisphere. So let me just label this so that you can know. Above is north, below is south, to your right is east, and then to your left is west. Now before I explain longitude and latitude, I want you to understand that every point on the Earth's surface has a corresponding latitude and longitude. Every point on the Earth's surface. Now the question you may want to ask is, what's the difference between latitude and longitude? Now latitude is an imaginary line that specifies location north or south of the equator, while longitude is an imaginary line that specifies location east or west of the prime meridian. Now I'm going to explain this with a diagram, but before I get to that, I want you to understand that latitude is like horizontal lines, and remember those lines are imaginary. Then longitude are vertical lines, and also the lines are imaginary. I hope you know what horizontal lines mean. Lines like this, these are horizontal lines. Then vertical lines are lines like this. Now let's represent this on the globe. So let's say we have the globe. Remember, this is the prime meridian, and this is the equator. Latitude are horizontal lines, north or south. The part above the equator, remember this is the equator, is north, and then the part below is south. So it then means that lines of latitude are these. They are horizontal lines. So these are lines of latitude. It can be north or south. Does this make sense? So these are lines of latitude. So anytime you see 40 degrees north, or 50 degrees south, or 20 degrees south, as long as it's north or south, just know that they are what? Lines of latitude. I hope you understand. Now for longitude, let's draw the globe. So we have the globe. Now this is the prime meridian, and this is the equator. Now longitude are like vertical lines on the east or on the west. Now remember, the right hand side of the prime meridian is the east, while the left hand side of the prime meridian is west. Does this make sense? So if we have any vertical line on the east of the prime meridian, we have lines of longitude, and then on the west we can have lines of longitude. Now it means that all these are lines of longitude. Does that make sense? So if you have 20-degree east, or you have 30 degrees west, or you have 40 degrees east, as long as you see east and west, they signify lines of longitude. I hope you understand that. So north and south signifies latitude, while east and west signifies longitude. Does that make sense? Now the last thing I need to explain is what we call great circles and small circles. Now the great circle divides the earth into two equal halves. So we have into two equal halves. While small circles is like the opposite. So small circles do not divide the earth into two equal halves. Now for small circles, all lines of latitude are small circles except the equator. So we have all lines of latitude except the equator. Now this here are lines of latitude. You can see that this one here is way smaller than this one here. Does that make sense? And the radius are different. For example, this is the radius of this line of latitude. This is the radius of this other line. Lines of latitude form what we know as the small circles, except the equator. This equator here. And the reason why the equator is not a small circle but a great circle is that if you look at this, divides the earth into two equal halves. Does that make sense? That's what we call an equator. An equator is a line that divides the earth into two equal halves, north and south hemisphere. Does that make sense? So all lines of latitude except the equator are small circles. Then for great circle, all lines of longitude and the equator are all great circle. All lines of longitude, all these lines are great circle. And it kind of makes sense because no matter the longitude, the radius is equal. So just have this at the back of your mind. All lines of latitude except the equator is a small circle. Then all lines of longitude and the equator is a great circle. I hope you understand.